I'm good? All right. This is definitely the full 30 minutes, so I don't want to start too late. Before I get started, everybody make sure you've turned off your cell phones and all of that stuff, so we're not accidentally disrupting the very important things I have to say. I also just found out I was quoted in the New York Times today, so you can tell I'm important. The exact quote was, "Nerds like to party and make stuff." So yeah. My name's Adam. I'm making a game called Overland. We're also publishing a game called Night in the Woods, and we're doing some other things. I've been a self-employed game maker since about 2006, and I wanted to kind of present to you guys a guide to the Finji Greenlight process, which is sort of how we decide what to work on and what to invest in. The simplest way to describe indie games, I think, is that the bar for selling games used to be really, really, really low. Indie games used to be way worse in almost every way. I feel like in the last 5 years, weird games got like way weirder. Polished games got more polished. Big games got bigger. Small games got smaller. And this was never a particularly low-risk industry to begin with. Democratization of game-making tools, flood of earnest and brilliant students, maybe a few AAA midlife crises. These things have all kind of raised the bar, I think. And there are games that I feel like were huge hits 5 years ago that wouldn't really stand out today. There's lots of pros and cons here. I think there's lots of things about this that are amazing. But regardless of all that, this is still a real thing that's actually happening. And on a more personal note, the bar has kind of been raised for us. My wife and I run this company together. We have a couple of kids now. The stakes for making and selling indie games feel pretty real, like all the time, 24/7. And so what we work on, how we work on it, all the potential upsides and downsides of those choices impact not just my wife and I now, but our kids and our stupid dogs. So what do we do as a company, as folks that sit around making indie games all day, to sort of survive in this new environment? My notes here say ruined hellscape. That seems a little strong for some reason. All you can do is hedge your bets, right? There are many parts of commercial game making that are just kind of out of our control. And this is not about guaranteeing a studio's survival, which I think is kind of impossible anyways. This is not about sort of slavishly adopting conventional wisdom in everything that you do. What I want to try to talk about is sort of doing the opposite. Let's talk about minimizing damage from and or justifying making a weird passion project into a commercial thing. So I think there's lots of talks and articles and blogs about how to hedge your bets during development and release and even post-release, but what about before? You know, if you've been making games for a while, you have probably noticed that the earlier you can discover flaws or errors, the more flexibility you have to adapt and either solve those problems or resolve them or dissolve them and strengthen your design. And I think this holds for projects as a whole. Design and production and marketing and technological and artistic components, the earlier you find the landmines in your path, the more time that you have to adapt. It's good to have a strong process. It's good to take your releases seriously. But I think for some problems, that's kind of too little too late. So what about before there is even a game? There's a lot of advice, conventional wisdom, right? Don't make an experimental game. Don't make a clone. Don't make a premium game. Don't make a free-to-play game. Don't make a casual game. Don't make a hardcore game, right? But making a commercial game is really risky. It's usually a bad idea. It's not a thing to be done lightly. So if you are going to do it, let's at least maybe acknowledge, potentially mitigate some of the risks involved. Let's try to still work on something that we love. And so this is kind of our mantra: hedge early, hedge often. And these are our, I wrote pro strats for pre-production, which doesn't really quite roll off the tongue quite right. That's okay. These are things that help us vet an idea before we even start work on a prototype sometimes. The first one is called Platonic Scope. It's kind of a dorky name for a thing, but I want to explain what I mean real quick. There's this thing that you can think of as like a game production Cerberus, this three-headed thing. There's scope and budget and schedule. These are basically fancy abstractions for some pretty discrete resources that you have as a game maker. There's sort of game quality or whatever you're building and whatever you're trying to output. There's the money you have. There's the time that you have. And if you imagine these as kind of like 3 points of a triangle, different games are going to sort of have different triangles. And different game ideas react to changes in these variables differently. Increasing the budget or the amount of time that you have to build something may or may not affect the ship date or the budget or the output quality. Since we're trying to make games commercially and somehow also eat food, time and money obviously matter a lot. But this quality question is kind of weird. There's this sort of philosophical notion of the Platonic ideal. This is something that is like the most perfect or true version of itself. It's somehow perfectly authentic. It's an thing. It is like its perfect essence or whatever. Our target for this quality thing that we're trying to achieve, I think, is to somehow create the Platonic version of any given game idea. So this is weird because it's radically different from game to game. The ideal sandbox game is going to be really different from the ideal RPG. And it's also totally impossible to actually do. Nobody's actually going to achieve this or pull this off. But I think it's still useful as sort of a target or something to aim at or something to think about when we're trying to kind of balance quality and money and time. So we have these 3 variables. Usually for us, time and money have kind of an upper boundary. And then we have this sort of like, what is the best version of any particular game according to its own rules? What is the Platonic ideal of that particular game idea? And so the first way that we try to manage risk when we're in the early stages of trying to decide what to work on next is to just ask this question. Given the time and money that we have access to, which of our game ideas can we get the closest to its Platonic ideal? This is a really insane question. There's like so many things going on. We may not have a prototype yet. Even if you do have a prototype, the kind of games that we build and the reason that we build them is they tend to grow in really unpredictable ways. We think that's a good thing, but you can grow a really big tree from a really small seed sometimes. So how do you even guess which of these game ideas we can actually get the closest to this desired output quality? Predicting absolutes is really hard. Accuracy in predicting the exact budget and dev time and design complexity and the final output quality of an original game idea is impossible, but I think you can kind of make a relative comparison. You can pit a handful of ideas against each other. You can imagine which one can take you farthest given the resources you have, and that might actually help. So that's where that dorky name comes from. You may be able to make a pretty good call about which of your game ideas you can take the farthest given the resources that you have. And this isn't the end-all be-all of greenlighting. It's kind of just sort of one of our first steps that we like. The next one is the inverse pyramid test, which I think sounds kind of ominous. But inverted pyramid is this kind of nice shape because it maintains the same overall profile over time as you add new layers. I think games that have this shape can kind of decrease risk over time because you can stop prototyping at any point and you have a game that has all the properties of the thing that you're trying to achieve. If you have vertical strata or you have a regular crappy pyramid, it doesn't really have the same weird shape maintaining property. These shapes, I think, are really obviously inherently incomplete or unstable until you get all the final touches done. So why does this matter? Sometimes budget and schedule estimates end up being slightly off. So if you end up not having as much time and money as you were hoping somehow, do you want to end up with a game like this, or do you want a game that looks more like this? This is also kind of known as minimum viable product, right? I didn't make this image, but I really, really like it because this particular metaphor, they're good, they're right, it's intelligent, but you can't use skateboard wheels on a bike. So you have to revisit the whole notion of wheels each time you do this next step. You have to question your old assumptions, which I think is a nice touch when you're trying to sum something up like this. Not every idea is going to be a good fit for this model, right? But this is kind of our whole point. These Pre-game considerations that we're talking about are not best practices. We're not talking about design methodologies. We're not talking about workflow processes. These are ways of interrogating or examining an idea or a concept that you have. For us, the inverse pyramid test usually means that we end up focusing on systems-based games as opposed to content-based games. So a game with a lot of randomly generated content might be a pretty good fit for us. It takes a long time to nail down the basics, but when you're done with that step, you have a good game that's just very small. And then you just have to sort of add new things to it. And as you do that, it tends to grow in a kind of an exponential way. Sandbox games tend to have this property also. I think this is, you end up in situations where you can add one thing and it actually doubles the size of the game or the expressive space of the game. And I think sandbox games being expressive, but sandbox games also having this property of, oh, we didn't get everything in that we wanted, but it's still a functioning thing is one reason that they're so popular right now. There's a weird thing about the shape of game too, which is new layers and mechanics as you go up might be adding disproportionate amounts of new content, because this isn't really just a triangle. This is like a multi-dimensional sort of prism that you're building as you build your game. And each new layer can add a lot, and it can alter and augment the existing layers. So when we're thinking about inverse pyramid or trying to think about minimum viable product, those are a bunch of the things that are on our mind when we're looking at game ideas. The next thing is the notion of taking creative risks, or another way to think about it is taking as many risks as possible without producing something that is completely alienating to people to a commercial audience, right? And why even bother? So, I mean, one reason to take creative risks is this may be why you went indie in the first place. It might be that nobody's making the game that you want to make. You notice that there's a gap that needs to be filled, or there's wilderness that needs to be explored. It's fun and feels really good. But it also is going to help your game differentiate itself from other games that are on the market right now. And this is kind of an apparent contradiction of commercial game making in a lot of ways. We are trying to make a game that looks like a commercial product that people want to exchange money for, but for practical reasons and for personal reasons, we need it to be somehow unique and to be new and to be original, to have a kind of a unique silhouette. And like, it's like if you've ever done contract work or something and somebody sends you like an email and they're like, hey, I want something really classic but timeless but modern. Like, that's the thing that we're dealing with, right? So we're trying to make a game that's not unbuyable. So, you know, what is this? What's this idea of buyable? What's a buyable game? What does that even mean? And I think there are different ways of thinking about that and defining that. But, you know, how big a game is it? How accessible is it? How sort of fair is it? Is it a an exciting power fantasy, or is this like a brutal, inaccessible thing? How deep do you have to dig to get to the interesting stuff versus how much of it has been kind of presented to you by the designer? The thing is, breaking some of these rules, I think, is a really great way to differentiate your game. And it's a way of kind of resolving this tension between making sort of a commercial product and making something original at the same time. So do you guys know this game, Minecraft? I don't know, it's been pretty hot lately. I don't think it's actually a particularly accessible game. I don't think it's actually that much of a polished game. I think it actually breaks a bunch of these rules. But if you go back to this list, the how much game is there part, it's really, really, really good at that. Gone Home is a pretty short game. There's not a lot of game there in a classic traditional sense. It's very polished. It's pretty accessible. It's about stories and themes that are new and have a kind of a broad audience. And I don't think any of these games really follow all the normal buyable formulation for a game. And I admire the way that these games take some progressive or challenging ideas and they find a way to sort of somehow still fit them just enough into this commercial game box to find a big audience and to support those developers doing their stuff. And there are lots of games that do follow all the rules, and they're still really neat games. These games, though, tend to be differentiated by just raw quality, or raw superficial quality even. they're very long games. They're very large games. They have very beautiful graphics that you can see and notice immediately. This game, the Bloodborne game, is pretty good, right? So these games, in some ways, I think, are taking fewer creative risks, but they're actually a lot riskier to do as a commercial venture. They have to have extremely good content. They tend to be really expensive to produce. If The Witness had puzzles that were just bad, that's not a thing that can support itself anymore suddenly. So there's a lot of kind of internal pressure there that you have to handle. And I think it's easier for small devs to differentiate by breaking some of these rules. So another way of looking at this is the idea that you can't make everyone happy all the time, which we've all heard a million times. We understand this on a cognitive level, on an emotional level. But when you're making art and you're trying to share it with the world, there's lots of tension or pressure to make concessions to reach out to new audiences, to draw in people who might not know about the thing that you're making, but you think that they'll totally love it. And if you're not careful, it's really easy to kind of sort of stair-step your way into suddenly trying to design for all audiences, even though you knew at the start that that was kind of a bad idea. And I think when you do this, you're kind of undermining the things that made your game so interesting and so different in the first place. If you tack on a crafting system or an RPG system, and you're starting to dilute the thing that maybe got people's attention in the first place. So creative risks. Feels good, helps you stand out. It's a tricky balance, though. You have to have a lot of confidence and humility at the same time. It's not easy. I think it's totally worth it, though. Last but not least, the final thing is something that I'm going to call exposure design, which is basically this. And it's not a thing that you do or don't do. Marketing sort of just is. It's the part of your game that people can see or hear about. The first time someone sees a screenshot of your game is kind of also the first time they experience your game. And I think those first impressions matter a lot. Some things that are marketing. Let's Play, seeing it on someone's phone on the bus. You saw a cool screenshot on Tumblr. You're looking at the loading screen, waiting for the game to actually start eventually. Somebody was just shouting at you last night about how cool it was. So if your project or your game is an iceberg, I kind of think of marketing as the 10% that sticks up out of the water. And that's called exposure. So marketing to us is basically exposure design, and I think it's really, really, really important. It's the only way that people get into the strange world that you put inside your game. For us, exposure design is the idea that you can and should pay a lot of attention to designing that little top piece. Because it bears a huge design burden. It's kind of a gate into your game. Often it's kind of a teacher. It needs to sort of be tempting. In some ways, it's sort of like a restaurant menu. It's kind of it's the outer layer of this weird psychic playground thing that you built and that you're trying to share with other people. And it's a fundamental part of building a commercial game. And it's not a question that you can answer before you've started working on the game. Any more than you can sit down and write a full game design document without even starting your prototype, right? Building original games tends to be the process of designing them and vice versa. But you can still think about this starting really, really early. So these are kind of within this way of interrogating our early game ideas or early prototype ideas. We also can sort of interrogate our marketing ideas. Does the 10% that's sticking out of the water communicate some of the qualities that make the game fit into that kind of marketing box? Does it also communicate the part where you broke the rules and you did things that don't normally fit in the box and that make it stand out and make it seem different? And does it say that clearly and efficiently to the people who are going to like those things that you put into your iceberg? This is really difficult. It's also really, really easy to test. On a lot of previous games that we've worked on, we've been able to come up with a pitch, decide oh, these are the magic words, this is the elevator pitch, this is the screenshot we need to show it to people, and if they don't care, then you're doing it wrong. And you just go back and try again. So that part of it is kind of nice. There's a lot of trial and error, but at least you can get really clear feedback really, really easily. The other thing that's weird is it's not about explaining the whole game in 5 seconds. It's way weirder than that. You're trying to communicate some kind of essential experience and not just game mechanics. So there's a reason that this list doesn't include over-explaining everything that your game does all the time. And because you are trying to communicate this essential experience and not just mechanics or story, the way that you design the exposure, the way that you do your marketing is going to vary enormously from project to project. And differentiation in exposure design or marketing has even more pressure because they don't even get to spend time with the whole game yet. They just have this little piece at the top that they're trying to check out. So what's going to make someone's eyes or ears or brain kind of stop and rest on that point before moving on to the next thing? What's going to sort of engender desire in them to talk about the little bit that they saw and to share it with their friends? This sounds really dramatic, but in a world of infinite icebergs, what makes yours so special? Whatever that quality is, can you tell by looking at that little top piece? And it's really tempting to think things like, well, the game is going to speak for itself, or I told lots of people about it. I already posted about it on Twitter twice, so we're pretty much fine. And in indie games for a while, we've been talking about this idea of the Qiang infinity hypothesis, which is named after Jamie Qiang from Clay, who's been a big inspiration for us. And it's sort of the notion that there are always more people out there who want to know about the thing that you made. Tom Francis, who's a former game journalist and now game designer, made a game called Gunpoint a little while ago that was, by all accounts, a pretty great, successful indie game. And he went and crunched the numbers and found that if you round to the closest integer, 0% of Steam users own a copy of Gunpoint. And he still sold more than enough to fund his entire current project, which is looking really good. Anyway, I think it's really tempting to think of marketing as something that you do later, as something that you do external to your game. And instead, I think you have to... It's not even whether or not you want to do this. Whether you like it or not, marketing is a very integral and natural part of your game design. So these are kind of our main pregame considerations when we are greenlighting projects at Finji. We try to think about how good can we get this idea with the resources that we have access to. What happens if we run out of time or money? Is the project going to be salvageable, or is it going to be kind of time to start scrambling? Is this an idea that we personally are passionate about and that we think will stand out because it's so different from everything else that's out there? And how hard are we going to have to work to be able to expose those special qualities to people who have never played this before and have no idea what it is? And kind of as a counterpoint, so I had all these games up here before because I think they take really interesting creative risks. FMV games were not a super hot genre up until pretty recently. These games are expressive, they're beautiful, they're smart. They're also really bad fits for the way that we actually make games. I probably wouldn't greenlight these projects because I don't know how to manage their scope. I don't know what to do if their budget was running low partway through. But I think these games are very good fits for the people that actually made them. These are games that were playing to the strengths of those teams in a really powerful way. This is a recent example of a game that I think is really smart, and this is the kind of thing that I feel like I understand pretty well, and I think that we would have probably greenlit and gone forward with. It's called Daggers. It doesn't have a whole lot of moving parts. If they decide to expand it later by adding a new piece, the core game is still there. The new piece isn't going to change the overall shape of that, but it may potentially make it bigger, deeper, more complex, more interesting in the future. It breaks some rules. It's a 3D FPS that just doesn't have any levels at all. And I think the screenshots have a pretty clear identity, and they do a pretty good job of showing most of what you do in this game. That's pretty much, you shoot orange finger lasers at skulls. That's everything. That's the whole game. They boxed it up. So does this mean that all arena shooters are a really good idea? No. But the mix of ingredients and ideas for this particular thing, I think, is really intelligent. So it may not even be that important that you follow all of our rules or whatever, right? Instead, you can start to think about, what do these mean for you? What do they mean for your background? What do they mean for your skills? What do they mean for your audience? What do they mean for your creative needs? And even more broadly, just like think about anything, kind of ever. So like, we've had this experience over and over and over in the last year where somebody runs up and they say, hey, just quit our job, invested our life savings in this thing. We didn't pay attention. We didn't do any of these steps at all. We just went in, we made something that looks a lot like other things, and it's halfway done, but we ran out of money, and we're just kind of wondering, what's the next step? Do we do some marketing or get a loan or what? And like, man, it's like way too late. Like, there's no good version of what to do next in that scenario. And I think a little bit more care a little bit earlier, just like in a game design where you would, start prototyping some of your core mechanics before you decide what the final boss battle is. Getting to some of this stuff earlier, I think, helps a lot. So that's our advice. Hedge early, hedge often, and that's actually all I have. I think I was done like a minute early or something. So yeah, thank you. I'll be in the wrap-up room afterward if you guys want to hang out or chat. And also, they are going to email you some evaluations about this session. I would encourage you to compliment me on my looks. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks.